In the sterile corridors of TechNova Industries after the executive floors had emptied, Brandon Brock quietly worked his evening magic. By day, he was just another invisible face pushing a mop cart through the gleaming headquarters of Seattle's most innovative tech company. The single father who cleaned up after billion-dollar decisions and emptied trash cans filled with discarded million-dollar ideas. But when the corporate warriors retreated to their penthouses and the building settled into its midnight silence, Brandon's weathered hands would pause over something far more complex than spilled coffee and scattered papers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of the suited executives rushing past him each morning could possibly know was that those same calloused fingers had once danced across quantum processors with the precision of a surgeon. That behind the faded janitor's uniform and quiet demeanor lived a mind that had revolutionized data compression algorithms for 3 major corporations before his world came crashing down. Before a custody battle drained his savings, before pride gave way to necessity, before MIT's youngest PhD graduate in computational physics found himself grateful for any job that let him pick up his 8-year-old daughter Emma from school each day. Tonight, as Brandon methodically cleaned the research and development wing, his eyes lingered on the massive quantum computer housed behind reinforced glass. TechNova's crown jewel, a $50 million marvel of engineering that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for weeks. Through the transparent barrier, he could see the telltale signs. The irregular pulse patterns in the cooling system, the subtle vibration in the quantum chamber that spoke of a calibration issue so precise that even TechNova's team of world-class engineers couldn't pinpoint it. But Brandon could. Just as he'd seen it before at Quantum Dynamics, just as he'd solved it at Data Core Systems, just as his published papers had predicted this exact failure mode 3 years ago when the industry was still celebrating this particular quantum architecture as impossibly stable. His reflection in the laboratory's polished floor reminded him of how far he'd fallen, or perhaps how far he'd chosen to fall. The divorce papers had been brutal. Dr. Brandon Brock, former Chief Technology Officer, former MIT wunderkind, former rising star of the quantum computing world, reduced to a footnote in legal documents that granted him partial custody and left him with debts that made his PhD feel like expensive toilet paper. The late Dr. Sarah Chen, his former mentor at MIT, had once told him that true genius reveals itself not in the spotlight but in the shadows where no one is watching. She'd been talking about late-night lab sessions and the quiet moments of breakthrough that happened when ego stepped aside and pure curiosity took over. Brandon had never imagined she was preparing him for this, watching billion-dollar mistakes unfold while he emptied wastebaskets and pretended not to understand the technical discussions happening around him. Emma's drawing, carefully folded in his uniform pocket, crinkled softly as he moved. She'd drawn him in a white lab coat with "World's Best Scientist Dad" written in purple crayon across the top. The innocent pride in her 8-year-old eyes when she'd given it to him had nearly broken his heart. To her, he was still the father who could explain why stars twinkled and how computers thought. She had no idea that Daddy now spends his nights cleaning the laboratories where he'd once been invited to present groundbreaking research. The TechNova building's 47 floors hummed with the kind of energy that only came from housing humanity's brightest minds working on tomorrow's impossible problems. But tonight, as Brandon's practiced movements carried him through the executive wing, he knew that all that brilliance was stumped by a quantum decoherence issue that he could solve with a 15-minute recalibration and a small software patch he'd written years ago. His industrial-grade mop bucket rolled silently across the polished marble, a mundane sound that masked the extraordinary knowledge moving through these halls unrecognized. In the building's security system, he was employee 4731, Brandon Brock, night shift maintenance. In the quantum physics journals gathering dust in university libraries, he was Dr. B. Brock, whose revolutionary work on quantum error correction had been cited in over 300 papers. Tomorrow, Victoria Vale, TechNova's brilliant and notoriously demanding CEO, would once again convene her team of experts to stare at readouts they couldn't decipher, trying to solve a problem that was costing the company millions in delayed product launches and shattered investor confidence. She'd pace her corner office, the one Brandon cleaned each night, frustrated by the gap between her company's reputation for innovation and their inability to fix their most critical technology. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the solution to their impossible problem walked among them every night, invisible in plain sight, a ghost of scientific brilliance hidden behind a badge that read "Maintenance Staff." Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of hidden genius and second chances, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if Brandon's story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will completely change how you think about the people around you. Sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the janitor cleaning your office might just be the genius you've been searching for. Because tomorrow night, when desperation finally meets opportunity, Victoria Vale is about to discover that her company's salvation has been mopping her floors all along. And what she'll witness in the next 5 minutes will challenge everything she thought she knew about talent, recognition, and the invisible heroes working right under our noses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The emergency board meeting had been called for 7 a.m. sharp, but Victoria Vale had been pacing her corner office since 5:30, watching the Seattle skyline emerge from the pre-dawn darkness. The quantum computer's latest diagnostic report lay scattered across her mahogany desk like evidence of corporate failure. 17 pages of technical jargon that all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. TechNova's revolutionary quantum processor, the centerpiece of their upcoming $3 billion product launch, was dying. Dr. Amanda Foster, TechNova's head of quantum research, sat rigidly in the leather chair across from Victoria's desk, her usually perfect composure cracked by weeks of sleepless nights. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, but neither woman was admiring the scenery. The quantum lab status monitors glowed ominously red on Victoria's wall-mounted displays, each crimson indicator representing another $1 million in potential losses. "Explain it to me one more time," Victoria said, her voice carrying the controlled frustration of a CEO who'd built her reputation on solving impossible problems, in terms that won't require a PhD to understand. Amanda cleared her throat nervously. The quantum decoherence is cascading through the entire system. Every calculation becomes exponentially more unstable, like trying to write with disappearing ink. We've tried recalibrating the cooling systems, adjusting the electromagnetic shielding, even replacing core components. Nothing works. Victoria picked up a tablet displaying their stock price, down 18% since the malfunction became public knowledge. And the timeline? "If we can't solve this by Friday," Amanda's voice trailed off, but they both knew the implications. The International Technology Summit was in 5 days, where TechNova was scheduled to demonstrate their quantum breakthrough to investors and competitors alike. Failure meant not just embarrassment, but the potential collapse of 2 years of development and the jobs of 300 employees. "Dr. Martinez from Stanford couldn't fix it," Amanda continued, checking her notes. "Neither could the IBM quantum team we flew in last week. Yesterday, we even brought in Professor Williams from CERN. He spent 8 hours analyzing the system and told us we might need to rebuild from scratch, a process that would take 18 months and $200 million we don't have." Victoria moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the brightening sky. At 34, she was the youngest female CEO in Seattle's tech corridor, a title she'd earned by turning TechNova from a struggling startup into a quantum computing powerhouse. But all of that meant nothing if their flagship technology failed on the world's biggest stage. "What about external consultants?" she asked. "There has to be someone somewhere who understands quantum error correction better than we do." Amanda pulled out another folder, this one thick with consultant profiles and research papers. "I've contacted everyone, literally everyone in the quantum computing field. Dr. Elizabeth Harper from MIT is booked solid with government contracts. The team from Google Quantum AI won't share their proprietary solutions. And the only independent researcher who might have had insights into this specific architecture." She paused, checking her notes. "Dr. B. Brock published some relevant papers a few years ago, but he seems to have vanished from the academic world. No one's heard from him since 2021. Victoria's jaw tightened. The irony wasn't lost on her. TechNova's quantum computer was based partially on theoretical frameworks that Dr. Brock had helped establish, yet the man himself had apparently disappeared when they needed him most. Keep trying to find him. Check every university, every research lab, every tech company. Someone that brilliant doesn't just vanish. The morning staff meeting in an hour would be brutal. Victoria would have to face her engineers, her investors, and her board of directors with nothing but bad news and dwindling options. The quantum computer that was supposed to revolutionize artificial intelligence, cryptography, and scientific modeling was instead becoming TechNova's most expensive failure. Through her office's smart glass, Victoria could see the night shift maintenance crew finishing their rounds. One figure moved methodically through the quantum lab, methodically cleaning around the very machine that was destroying her company's future. There was something almost poetic about it. While the world's brightest minds failed to understand the quantum computer's mysteries, a janitor simply cleaned around it, probably never giving a second thought to the billions of calculations flickering behind the reinforced glass. "Amanda," Victoria said, suddenly, an idea forming. "What if we're approaching this wrong? What if the solution isn't more complexity, but elegant simplicity? Sometimes the most sophisticated problems have surprisingly straightforward solutions." Amanda looked skeptical. "Victoria, we've tried everything from basic resets to complete quantum state reconstruction. This isn't a software glitch, it's a fundamental breakdown in quantum coherence that's stumping the world's leading experts." Victoria nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the maintenance worker below. In 5 days, she would either present a working quantum computer to the world or watch her company's reputation crumble in real time. The clock was ticking, the experts were stumped, and somewhere in the building that housed humanity's most advanced technology, the night shift was ending as another day of impossible challenges began. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the solution to her billion-dollar crisis had just finished mopping the floor directly beneath her. The conference room on TechNova's 32nd floor buzzed with the nervous energy of brilliant minds confronting their own limitations. Victoria Vale sat at the head of the polished titanium table, watching her team of quantum engineers, each one hand-picked from the world's most prestigious institutions, struggle with readings that made less sense with each passing hour. Dr. Amanda Foster stood before the wall-mounted displays, her laser pointer trembling slightly as she highlighted the latest cascade of failures. "The quantum decoherence rate has increased another 12% overnight," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of impending defeat. "We're now looking at complete system failure within 72 hours, not the 5 days we originally projected." Around the table, TechNova's brightest minds shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. Dr. James Chen from Berkeley, brought in at considerable expense, rubbed his temples as he stared at data that defied his 20 years of quantum mechanics expertise. Professor Rachel Kim from Tokyo Institute of Technology had filled 3 whiteboards with equations that led nowhere. Even Dr. Mikhail Petrov, the Russian quantum theorist whose work on quantum error correction had earned him a Nobel Prize nomination, sat in stunned silence. "The electromagnetic interference patterns don't match any known quantum signatures," Dr. Chen muttered, his confidence from yesterday's consultation now completely evaporated. "It's like the system is generating its own unique form of chaos that follows no established principles." Victoria's tablet chimed with another urgent message from the board of directors, the 3rd one in an hour. She silenced it without reading, knowing it would only contain more pressure about the International Technology Summit, more questions about contingency plans that didn't exist, more reminders of the $3 billion in pre-orders that hung in the balance. "What about the backup quantum array?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer from Amanda's expression. "Infected," Amanda replied grimly. "Whatever's causing the primary system's degradation is spreading to our secondary units. It's unprecedented. Quantum computers aren't supposed to influence each other through conventional electromagnetic means, but somehow the instability is propagating across our entire quantum network." Professor Kim looked up from her calculations, her face pale with exhaustion. "In 30 years of quantum research, I've never seen anything like this. The decoherence patterns are almost intelligent, as if the system is actively resisting our repair attempts." The room fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of Seattle traffic 40 floors below. Through the conference room's panoramic windows, the morning sun painted Elliott Bay in shades of gold, a beautiful contrast to the corporate crisis unfolding in the climate-controlled environment of TechNova's headquarters. Victoria stood and moved to the Quantum Lab's live feed displayed on the room's largest monitor. The $50 million machine sat behind its reinforced glass barrier, its status lights flickering in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Around its base, she could see the subtle evidence of the night shift's work: polished floors, emptied waste bins, the kind of invisible maintenance that kept a billion-dollar facility running smoothly. "The cleaning crew," she said suddenly, causing every head in the room to turn toward her. "They work around this equipment every night. Could they have accidentally disturbed something, changed a setting, disconnected a cable?" Dr. Petrov shook his head emphatically. "Impossible. The quantum chamber is completely isolated. Even if someone had direct access to the core systems, which they don't, this type of systemic failure requires deep understanding of quantum mechanics to trigger. You can't accidentally cause quantum decoherence. It's like accidentally performing brain surgery." Amanda pulled up the security footage from the past week on her tablet. "Besides, the night maintenance staff never enters the quantum lab itself. They clean the observation areas and corridors, but the actual computing chamber is off-limits to anyone with Level 7 clearance." She scrolled through several nights of footage, showing the methodical work of the cleaning crew. "Look, they're incredibly careful, professional. Mostly it's just one guy, actually. Works alone, very thorough." Victoria found herself studying the grainy security footage with unexpected interest. The lone maintenance worker moved through the lab spaces with an efficiency that spoke of familiarity and respect for the equipment around him. There was something almost reverential in how he navigated around the quantum computer's housing, never rushing, never careless. "What's his clearance level?" Victoria asked, though she wasn't entirely sure why the question mattered. "Standard maintenance," Amanda replied, checking her tablet. "Brandon Brock, hired 8 months ago. Former academic background in some kind of science, but his file is pretty sparse. Just references and basic background check. Nothing that would qualify him for technical access to quantum systems." Dr. Chen laughed bitterly. "Even if he had a PhD in quantum physics, it wouldn't matter. This problem is beyond academic understanding. It's beyond all of us, apparently." The conference room's atmosphere grew heavier with each failed hypothesis. Victoria watched her team, globally recognized experts commanding million-dollar consulting fees, reduced to helpless spectators of their field's most expensive failure. In less than 72 hours, she would have to stand before the world's technology leaders and admit that TechNova's revolutionary quantum computer was nothing more than an extraordinarily expensive paperweight. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, more to herself than to the room. Professor Kim closed her laptop with a frustrated snap. "Victoria, we've analyzed every component, every algorithm, every possible interference source. Unless you have access to quantum expertise that doesn't exist in the academic world, we're looking at complete system reconstruction." As if summoned by their collective despair, Victoria's assistant knocked and entered with another stack of consultant proposals, more brilliant minds offering solutions that would take months to implement and cost fortunes they didn't have. The morning sun climbed higher over Seattle, marking another hour lost in their race against technological catastrophe. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that their missing quantum expertise was 3 floors below them, emptying trash bins and preparing for another day of invisible competence. The solution to their billion-dollar crisis would soon emerge from the most unexpected source imaginable, challenging everything they thought they knew about where genius hides and how miracles happen in the corporate world.
The afternoon shift change at TechNova brought a familiar ritual that Brandon Brock had grown to cherish over his 8 months of employment. As the corporate executives departed for their long lunches and strategic meetings, the building settled into a quieter rhythm that allowed him to think, to observe, and to pretend that the brilliant minds around him weren't completely missing what seemed obvious to his trained eye. Brandon pushed his maintenance cart through the 32nd floor corridors, the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before, but today felt different. The tension in the building was palpable. Hushed conversations in hallways, worried faces clustered around computer screens, the kind of corporate anxiety that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Through the conference room's glass walls, he could see the aftermath of the morning's crisis meeting. Whiteboards covered in quantum equations, tablets scattered across the table like fallen soldiers, and coffee cups bearing the remnants of what had clearly been a very long discussion. The quantum lab itself drew him like a magnet, just as it had every day since he'd started working here. Standing in the observation corridor, Brandon studied the massive machine through the reinforced glass, his janitor's uniform a stark contrast to the billions of dollars of cutting-edge technology before him. To everyone else, he was just another invisible worker going about his mundane tasks. But to Brandon, this moment represented a daily exercise in self-control that was becoming harder to maintain. His daughter Emma's latest science fair project sat folded in his uniform pocket, a science fair presentation about quantum computers that she'd asked him to help with. The innocent questions she'd posed over breakfast that morning echoed in his mind. "Dad, why do quantum computers sometimes stop working? And how come you know so much about them if you're just a janitor?" The trust in her 8-year-old eyes when she called him her genius daddy had nearly broken his resolve to remain hidden. Emma didn't understand the complexities of adult pride, financial desperation, or the way the academic world could chew up and spit out even its brightest stars. She only knew that her father had once worn white lab coats and worked with computers that could think faster than human brains, as she liked to tell her classmates. The custody agreement that had cost him everything was worth it to see her twice a week. But explaining why Daddy now mopped floors instead of solving impossible problems required a delicate balance of truth and protection. Through the quantum lab's observation window, Brandon could see the telltale signs that the world's most expensive experts were missing entirely. The cooling system's fluctuation patterns weren't random. They followed a specific frequency that matched the quantum decoherence cascade he'd written about in his 2020 paper on thermal interference in large-scale quantum arrays. The electromagnetic readings displayed on the monitoring systems showed exactly the signature he'd predicted would occur when certain quantum architectures reached critical mass without proper isolation protocols. His hands tightened on the mop handle as he remembered the late nights at MIT when Dr. Sarah Chen had challenged him to think beyond conventional quantum error correction. "Brandon," she'd said during one of their legendary 3 a.m. lab sessions, "the most elegant solutions often violate our assumptions about complexity. What if quantum decoherence isn't the enemy, but a navigation system we haven't learned to read?" That conversation had led to his breakthrough paper on quantum error correction through controlled decoherence, a theoretical framework that most of the academic world had dismissed as too radical to implement. Only a handful of researchers understood that Brandon wasn't proposing to fight quantum decoherence, but to dance with it, to use its patterns as a guide for system recalibration rather than something to be brute force corrected. The irony was almost painful. TechNova's quantum computer was exhibiting exactly the controlled decoherence patterns he'd theorized, but instead of recognizing it as a feature to be leveraged, their team of experts was treating it as a catastrophic failure to be stopped. They were trying to silence a conversation that the quantum system was desperately trying to have with them. The reflection in the lab's polished surfaces reminded him of the choice he faced every day. He could continue his carefully maintained invisibility, collecting his modest paycheck and preserving the quiet dignity that allowed him to provide for Emma. Or he could risk everything: his job, his anonymity, his protection from the academic world that had already chewed him up once, to solve a problem that was destroying the company where he'd found unexpected refuge. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his contemplation. Victoria Vale herself was walking down the corridor. Her purposeful stride and tense expression suggested another crisis meeting or emergency consultation. Brandon immediately busied himself with cleaning the already spotless floor, becoming invisible in the way that service workers had perfected across centuries of moving through spaces owned by more powerful people. As she passed, Victoria paused at the Quantum Lab's observation window, standing just feet away from Brandon as she stared at the same machine that had captured his attention. For a moment, they shared the space in the silence. The brilliant CEO who'd built an empire on innovation, and the hidden genius who'd once revolutionized the very technology now threatening to destroy her company. "If only we could ask it what's wrong," Victoria murmured, apparently thinking she was alone. "If only quantum computers could just tell us what they need."
Brandon's grip on his mop tightened. The machine was telling them exactly what it needed, screaming its requirements in the language of quantum decoherence patterns that he could read as clearly as Emma's bedtime stories. The solution was elegant, achievable, and could be implemented in minutes rather than months. All it required was someone willing to listen to what the quantum system was actually trying to communicate. As Victoria walked away, Brandon remained frozen in place, torn between the safety of invisibility and the growing certainty that his conscience wouldn't allow him to watch TechNova's brilliant people fail when he held the key to their salvation. Somewhere in the building's executive offices, desperate phone calls were being made to consultants who would never see what he saw. Time was running out, and the weight of unspoken knowledge was becoming heavier than his fear of exposure. The decision that would change everything was crystallizing in his mind, though he didn't yet know that within 24 hours, Victoria Vale would issue a challenge that would make his choice for him. The digital clock on Brandon's phone read 11:47 p.m. as he stood alone in the Quantum Lab's observation corridor, the building's daytime chaos having given way to the peaceful solitude that had become his thinking sanctuary. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the polished floors, and the quantum computer status displays painted the reinforced glass in alternating patterns of amber and red, a visual symphony of systematic failure that only he seemed able to interpret. Tonight felt different from all the others. The desperation in Victoria Vale's voice during her afternoon phone calls had carried through the building's ventilation system to where Brandon worked methodically around the executive offices. He'd overheard fragments of increasingly frantic conversations with board members, investors, and quantum experts from around the globe. The timeline had compressed from days to hours, and TechNova's stock price had begun its evening freefall on international markets. Brandon's maintenance cart sat forgotten near the corridor entrance as he approached the Quantum Lab's security console. His employee badge, the basic access card that identified him as nothing more than custodial staff, hung from his belt like a symbol of the choice he was about to make. The security system's logs would record this moment, creating digital evidence of what he was about to do. There would be no hiding afterward, no returning to the comfortable anonymity that had protected him for 8 months. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the small leather notebook from his uniform pocket. Not the company-issued cleaning checklist, but his personal journal filled with 8 months of observations, calculations, and theoretical solutions. Every night since starting at TechNova, he documented the quantum computer's behavioral patterns, tracking the subtle changes that preceded its current crisis. The notebook contained what amounted to a complete diagnostic history written in his own theoretical framework, a framework that the academic world had once dismissed as too unconventional to pursue. The quantum computer hummed behind its protective barriers, its cooling systems working overtime to maintain the delicate environmental conditions necessary for quantum coherence. Brandon could hear the subtle irregularities in the electromagnetic stabilizers, the minute fluctuations that spoke of a system trying to achieve equilibrium through patterns that conventional quantum theory couldn't accommodate. He thought of Emma, asleep in her mother's apartment across town, probably dreaming of the science fair project they'd discussed over breakfast. She'd asked him to explain quantum entanglement using her favorite analogy about invisible friendship bracelets that could feel each other no matter how far apart they were. Her innocent questions had cut straight to the heart of quantum mechanics in ways that her former colleagues' complex mathematical proofs had sometimes missed. "Daddy, why don't the computer doctors just ask the computer what's wrong?" she'd wondered aloud while working on her poster board. "When I'm sick, I tell the doctor where it hurts." The question had haunted him all day, because Emma was essentially correct. The quantum computer was telling everyone what was wrong, broadcasting its distress in the precise language of quantum decoherence patterns. The problem wasn't that the machine was broken. It was that the machine was trying to evolve beyond its original programming parameters, reaching for a more sophisticated operational state that its designers hadn't anticipated. Brandon opened his notebook to the calculations he'd worked out 3 nights ago, when the decoherence patterns had suddenly clarified into what he recognized as a quantum state transition. The system wasn't failing. It was attempting to upgrade itself to a higher level of quantum coherence that required a fundamentally different calibration approach. Instead of fighting the decoherence, we needed to guide it, to help the quantum computer achieve the state it was reaching for. The solution required a delicate recalibration sequence that would temporarily increase the apparent chaos before achieving unprecedented stability. It was precisely the kind of controlled quantum evolution he'd theorized in his academic papers, the research that had made him a rising star before his personal life collapsed and forced him into hiding. Through the lab's security console, Brandon could access the building's maintenance protocols, but what he needed went far beyond changing air filters or adjusting lighting systems. The quantum computer's calibration interface required Level 7 clearance, the kind of access reserved for senior engineers and visiting experts, the kind of access that a janitor could never legitimately possess. But Brandon knew something that TechNova security designers hadn't considered. Every maintenance access point in the building was connected to the same central system that controlled environmental conditions throughout the facility. And environmental controls for a quantum computer lab required integration with the quantum systems themselves to maintain the precise conditions necessary for coherent operation. His fingers moved across the maintenance console with practiced efficiency, navigating through layers of building automation protocols until he found the environmental controls for the quantum lab. From there, it was a matter of understanding how TechNova's engineers had integrated their climate systems with their quantum calibration protocols, an integration he'd been studying for months through the reports and diagnostics that ended up in various trash bins throughout the building. The irony wasn't lost on him. His access to confidential information came not from corporate espionage or hacking, but from the simple fact that people threw away drafts, printouts, and technical memos without considering that the person emptying their wastebaskets might actually understand what they were reading. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Good luck at work tonight, Daddy. I hope you get to help with science stuff." She'd sent it hours ago, probably right before bed, but he'd only just seen it. The innocent encouragement from his daughter felt like a sign, a reminder that some opportunities only came once. The quantum computer's status displays flickered as Brandon initiated the first phase of the recalibration sequence he'd designed. The building's security system logged his actions as routine environmental maintenance, but what he was actually doing would either save TechNova's billion-dollar investment or destroy his last chance at a quiet, stable life. As the quantum decoherence patterns began to shift in response to his adjustments, Brandon realized there was no turning back. By morning, either Victoria Vale would discover that her impossible problem had been solved by the janitor who cleaned her office, or Brandon Brock would be explaining to unemployment officials why he'd been terminated from yet another job. The quantum computer's cooling systems hummed with new harmonics as Brandon's theoretical framework began translating into practical reality. For the first time in 8 months, he was doing what he'd been born to do, and the machine was responding like a patient finally receiving the medicine it had been desperately needing. Victoria Vale's morning coffee sat untouched on her desk as she stared at the quantum computer's diagnostic readouts with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message from another dimension. The numbers on her screen defied everything she understood about quantum mechanics, corporate crisis management, and the basic laws of technological physics. According to every monitoring system in TechNova's arsenal, their $50 million quantum computer had somehow healed itself overnight. The emergency conference call with her engineering team had started at 6 a.m. and stretched into its third hour, with experts from around the globe struggling to explain readings that seemed to mock their collective PhD credentials. Dr. Amanda Foster's voice crackled through the speaker system from the quantum lab, where she'd been running verification tests since discovering the impossible data at dawn. "Victoria, I've run the diagnostics 17 times," Amanda reported, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "The quantum decoherence has completely stabilized, not just improved, completely resolved. The system is operating at efficiency levels we've never seen before, running calculations that should theoretically be impossible with our current architecture." Professor Kim's voice joined the conference from Tokyo, where she'd been awakened at midnight for the emergency consultation. "The coherence patterns don't match any known quantum stabilization techniques. It's as if someone implemented a theoretical framework that exists only in academic papers, and papers that most of the field considers too experimental to attempt." Victoria's mind raced through the possibilities, none of which made sense. "Amanda, I need you to check something. The security logs from last night, who had access to the quantum lab between midnight and 6 a.m.? The sound of rapid typing filled the speaker before Amanda responded. "That's just it, Victoria. No one with technical clearance entered the lab. The only logged activity was routine environmental maintenance by—" She paused, checking her records. "Brandon Brock, night shift maintenance. But he only accessed climate control systems, nothing that could affect quantum operations." Dr. Chen's skeptical voice cut through the confusion from his Berkeley office. "Environmental systems can't cause quantum stabilization. You'd need deep understanding of quantum error correction, advanced programming skills, and access to calibration protocols that don't exist in any maintenance manual." Victoria stood and moved to her office window, looking down at the quantum lab 40 floors below. The impossibility of the situation was driving her legendary analytical mind toward a conclusion that seemed absurd yet increasingly unavoidable. "Amanda, pull up the security footage from last night. Focus on the quantum lab observation areas between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Minutes passed before Amanda's voice returned, now carrying a note of confusion that made Victoria's pulse quicken. "Victoria, you need to see this. The maintenance worker, Brandon, he wasn't just cleaning. He spent almost 4 hours in the observation corridor, and, well, it looks like he was studying the quantum systems, really studying them, taking notes, making calculations." The conference line fell silent except for the hum of international phone connections. Victoria felt something shift in her understanding of the crisis, like a puzzle piece clicking into place in a picture she hadn't known she was assembling. "Send me that footage immediately," Victoria commanded, her CEO instincts sharpening around a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about her own company.
And Amanda, I want you to pull Brandon Brock's employment file, everything we have.
While waiting for the documents, Victoria opened her laptop and began researching quantum stabilization techniques that could produce the results they were seeing. The academic papers that appeared in her search results painted a picture of theoretical frameworks so advanced that only a handful of researchers worldwide were even attempting to understand them. Her assistant knocked and entered with a thin manila folder, Brandon Brock's employment record. Victoria flipped it open, scanning the sparse documentation with growing intrigue. Former academic background, the file noted vaguely, but no specifics about field of study or level of education. His previous employment history showed a concerning gap from 2021 to his hiring at TechNova, with only personal references and a basic background check. Victoria, Amanda's voice came through the speaker with urgency. I'm looking at the maintenance access logs more carefully. The environmental systems that Brandon accessed, they're integrated with our quantum calibration protocols. Someone with sufficient knowledge could theoretically use climate control access to influence quantum operations, but they'd need to understand our specific system architecture at a level that would require years of study, Victoria finished quietly, pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to form a recognizable picture. The security footage arrived in her email as Amanda spoke. Victoria opened the file and watched with growing amazement as the grainy surveillance video showed Brandon Brock moving through the quantum lab corridor with the focused intensity of someone conducting serious scientific research. The man in the janitor's uniform wasn't cleaning. He was diagnosing, calculating, and apparently implementing solutions to problems that had stumped the world's leading quantum experts. Dr. Foster, Victoria said carefully, I want you to research something for me. Look up any academic papers on quantum error correction published between 2018 and 2021 by someone with the surname Brock. Focus on theoretical frameworks for controlled decoherence. The typing sounds that followed were rapid and urgent. Victoria watched the security footage loop again, noting how Brandon handled himself around the quantum equipment, not with the careful distance of a custodial worker, but with the familiarity of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. Oh my God, Amanda whispered through the speaker. Victoria, I found him, Dr. B. Brock, Brandon Brock, quantum physics PhD from MIT, former CTO at Quantum Dynamics, published groundbreaking research on quantum error correction through controlled decoherence. His papers are cited in over 300 research studies, including some of the theoretical foundations we used for our own quantum architecture. The conference line erupted in excited voices. Professor Kim's voice rose above the others. His 2020 paper on thermal interference in large-scale quantum arrays, that's exactly what we've been dealing with. But the academic world thought his solutions were too radical to implement. Victoria felt her worldview reshaping itself around a truth that seemed stranger than fiction. The janitor who cleaned her office, who emptied her wastebaskets and maintained the humble invisibility that service workers perfected, was apparently one of the world's leading quantum physicists. The man who had saved her company's billion-dollar investment was the same person she passed in hallways without a second glance. Where is he now? Victoria asked, already standing and reaching for her jacket. According to the shift schedule, Amanda replied, he should be somewhere in the building. Day shift maintenance rounds usually start on the lower floors and work up. Victoria was already moving toward her office door, her mind racing with questions about hidden genius, corporate blindness, and the extraordinary man who had apparently been solving impossible problems while the world's experts struggled in conference rooms high above his head. Victoria Vale's heart pounded as she stepped out of the executive elevator onto the 14th floor, her heels clicking against the polished marble with an urgency that drew curious glances from passing employees. She'd spent the entire ride down mentally rehearsing different approaches for what might be the most important conversation of her career. How do you address someone you've unknowingly overlooked for 8 months? How do you acknowledge genius that's been hiding in plain sight while you desperately search the globe for expertise that was already in your building? The facilities management office directed her to the East Wing, where Brandon Brock was reportedly conducting his daily maintenance rounds.
Victoria found herself moving through sections of TechNova that she rarely visited, the practical, unglamorous areas where the real work of keeping a 47-story technology hub operational happened quietly and efficiently. The contrast wasn't lost on her. While she'd been panicking in executive conference rooms, the solution to her company's crisis had been methodically working just floors below. She found him in the research archive room, carefully organizing cleaning supplies while humming quietly to himself. For a moment, Victoria hesitated in the doorway, studying the man who had apparently saved her company without fanfare or recognition. Brandon Brock looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a middle-aged maintenance worker in a worn uniform moving with the practiced efficiency of someone comfortable with honest labor. Nothing in his appearance suggested the extraordinary mind that had revolutionized quantum computing theory. "Mr. Brock," Victoria's voice carried more uncertainty than she'd intended, the usual commanding tone of a CEO replaced by something approaching genuine curiosity. Brandon looked up from his supply cart, his expression shifting through surprise, recognition, and what might have been resignation. "Mr. Vale," he replied quietly, straightening but maintaining the respectful distance that 8 months of service work had ingrained. "Is there something I can help you with?"
The afternoon shift change at TechNova brought a familiar ritual that Brandon Brock had grown to cherish over his 8 months of employment. As the corporate executives departed for their long lunches and strategic meetings, the building settled into a quieter rhythm that allowed him to think, to observe, and to pretend that the brilliant minds around him weren't completely missing what seemed obvious to his trained eye. Brandon pushed his maintenance cart through the 32nd floor corridors, the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before, but today felt different. The tension in the building was palpable. Hushed conversations in hallways, worried faces clustered around computer screens, the kind of corporate anxiety that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Through the conference room's glass walls, he could see the aftermath of the morning's crisis meeting. Whiteboards covered in quantum equations, tablets scattered across the table like fallen soldiers, and coffee cups bearing the remnants of what had clearly been a very long discussion. The quantum lab itself drew him like a magnet, just as it had every day since he'd started working here. Standing in the observation corridor, Brandon studied the massive machine through the reinforced glass, his janitor's uniform a stark contrast to the billions of dollars of cutting-edge technology before him. To everyone else, he was just another invisible worker going about his mundane tasks. But to Brandon, this moment represented a daily exercise in self-control that was becoming harder to maintain. His daughter Emma's latest science fair project sat folded in his uniform pocket, a science fair presentation about quantum computers that she'd asked him to help with. The innocent questions she'd posed over breakfast that morning echoed in his mind. "Dad, why do quantum computers sometimes stop working? And how come you know so much about them if you're just a janitor?" The trust in her 8-year-old eyes when she called him her genius daddy had nearly broken his resolve to remain hidden. Emma didn't understand the complexities of adult pride, financial desperation, or the way the academic world could chew up and spit out even its brightest stars. She only knew that her father had once worn white lab coats and worked with computers that could think faster than human brains, as she liked to tell her classmates. The custody agreement that had cost him everything was worth it to see her twice a week. But explaining why Daddy now mopped floors instead of solving impossible problems required a delicate balance of truth and protection. Through the quantum lab's observation window, Brandon could see the telltale signs that the world's most expensive experts were missing entirely. The cooling system's fluctuation patterns weren't random. They followed a specific frequency that matched the quantum decoherence cascade he'd written about in his 2020 paper on thermal interference in large-scale quantum arrays. The electromagnetic readings displayed on the monitoring systems showed exactly the signature he'd predicted would occur when certain quantum architectures reached critical mass without proper isolation protocols. His hands tightened on the mop handle as he remembered the late nights at MIT when Dr. Sarah Chen had challenged him to think beyond conventional quantum error correction. "Brandon," she'd said during one of their legendary 3 a.m. lab sessions, "the most elegant solutions often violate our assumptions about complexity. What if quantum decoherence isn't the enemy, but a navigation system we haven't learned to read?" That conversation had led to his breakthrough paper on quantum error correction through controlled decoherence, a theoretical framework that most of the academic world had dismissed as too radical to implement. Only a handful of researchers understood that Brandon wasn't proposing to fight quantum decoherence, but to dance with it, to use its patterns as a guide for system recalibration rather than something to be brute force corrected. The irony was almost painful. TechNova's quantum computer was exhibiting exactly the controlled decoherence patterns he'd theorized, but instead of recognizing it as a feature to be leveraged, their team of experts was treating it as a catastrophic failure to be stopped. They were trying to silence a conversation that the quantum system was desperately trying to have with them. The reflection in the lab's polished surfaces reminded him of the choice he faced every day. He could continue his carefully maintained invisibility, collecting his modest paycheck and preserving the quiet dignity that allowed him to provide for Emma. Or he could risk everything: his job, his anonymity, his protection from the academic world that had already chewed him up once, to solve a problem that was destroying the company where he'd found unexpected refuge. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his contemplation. Victoria Vale herself was walking down the corridor. Her purposeful stride and tense expression suggested another crisis meeting or emergency consultation. Brandon immediately busied himself with cleaning the already spotless floor, becoming invisible in the way that service workers had perfected across centuries of moving through spaces owned by more powerful people. As she passed, Victoria paused at the Quantum Lab's observation window, standing just feet away from Brandon as she stared at the same machine that had captured his attention. For a moment, they shared the space in the silence. The brilliant CEO who'd built an empire on innovation, and the hidden genius who'd once revolutionized the very technology now threatening to destroy her company. "If only we could ask it what's wrong," Victoria murmured, apparently thinking she was alone. "If only quantum computers could just tell us what they need." The formal politeness in his voice made Victoria realize how carefully he'd maintained his invisible status, how completely he'd committed to his role as just another overlooked employee. She took a step into the room, noting how his hands unconsciously moved to straighten his uniform, a gesture that spoke of someone accustomed to being judged by appearances rather than capabilities. "I think," Victoria said carefully, "that you've already helped more than you know. The quantum computer, it's working perfectly this morning, running calculations we thought were impossible, operating at efficiency levels that our engineers say shouldn't be achievable with our current architecture." Brandon's expression remained neutral, but Victoria caught the slight shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the handle of his cleaning cart. "That's wonderful news, Ms. Vale. I'm sure your technical team is very pleased." The careful deflection confirmed what Victoria had begun to suspect during her elevator ride. Brandon Brock wasn't just hiding his academic credentials, he was actively protecting them, maintaining a cover so complete that even direct recognition couldn't immediately penetrate it. "The security footage from last night shows you spending considerable time near the quantum lab, making observations, taking notes. That's not typical maintenance behavior." For the first time, Brandon's carefully constructed facade showed cracks. His eyes met hers directly, and Victoria saw something she recognized from her own reflection during TechNova's early years: the look of someone carrying knowledge they couldn't safely share. "I'm curious about technology," Brandon said finally, his voice carrying new undertones of caution and evaluation. "Working around such advanced equipment, it's natural to wonder how it functions." Victoria nodded slowly,
recognizing the delicate dance they were performing. Curiosity is valuable, especially when it comes from someone with a PhD in quantum physics from MIT. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Brandon's careful mask finally slipped, revealing not just surprise, but something deeper, relief mixed with terror, the expression of someone whose greatest secret had been discovered, but wasn't yet sure whether that discovery meant salvation or destruction. Dr. Amanda Foster found your papers, your research on controlled decoherence, thermal interference in quantum arrays. She says your theoretical frameworks form the foundation for some of our quantum architecture. Brandon leaned against his cleaning cart, the weight of 8 months of hiding suddenly visible in his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost long before he'd arrived at TechNova. "That research belongs to a different life," he said quietly. "Dr. Brandon Brock published those papers." Brandon Brock, maintenance staff, just empties trash cans and keeps floors clean. The pain in his voice made Victoria step closer, corporate hierarchies temporarily forgotten in the face of human understanding. What happened? Why is one of the world's leading quantum physicists working as a janitor? Divorce lawyers are expensive. Custody battles are expensive. Pride is a luxury you can't afford when your 8-year-old daughter needs stability. He gestured to his uniform with a bitter smile. "This job lets me pick Emma up from school twice a week and keep a roof over my head. Dr. Brock's credentials couldn't do that after my world collapsed." I felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The gap in his employment history, the sparse personnel file, the careful way he'd maintained his invisibility. "But last night, you couldn't just watch the quantum computer fail." "No," Brandon admitted, his professional mask finally dropping completely. "I couldn't watch brilliant people struggle with a problem I knew how to solve. The decoherence patterns were textbook examples of what I had written about. The quantum system wasn't failing, it was trying to evolve. It just needed someone to guide the transition instead of fighting it." Victoria studied his face, seeing past the maintenance uniform to the passionate scientist underneath. "The solution you implemented. Our engineers say it should be impossible without months of preparation and testing." "Your engineers are thinking too conventionally," Brandon replied, and for the first time Victoria heard the confidence of the researcher who had once revolutionized quantum theory. "They're trying to force the quantum computer to behave according to their expectations instead of listening to what it's actually trying to communicate." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's phone buzzing with urgent messages. Board members demanding explanations for the overnight miracle, investors wanting to understand how TechNova had suddenly achieved quantum breakthroughs that their competitors couldn't match. "Brandon," Victoria said using his first name deliberately, "I have a proposition for you. But first, I need to know, are you ready to stop being invisible?" The question hung between them as Brandon considered not just a career opportunity, but the chance to reclaim an identity he thought was lost forever. In the practical surroundings of the archive room, with cleaning supplies and corporate secrets as witnesses, 2 people stood on the edge of a transformation that would change both their futures. The anonymous email arrived in Victoria's inbox at 2:47 p.m., just as she was drafting a press release about TechNova's quantum breakthrough. The subject line read, "Your miracle worker's real story," and the sender was listed only as a concerned industry professional. Victoria's blood ran cold as she opened the message and found a detailed dossier on Brandon Brock that painted a picture far more complex than the heroic narrative she'd been constructing.
The attached documents told a story of academic scandal that had been carefully buried 3 years ago. Dr. Brandon Brock hadn't simply left quantum dynamics voluntarily. He'd been forced out amid allegations of research misconduct and intellectual property theft. The emails included corporate memos suggesting that Brandon had been caught selling proprietary quantum algorithms to competing firms, using his access to classified research to fund his expensive divorce proceedings.
Victoria's hands trembled as she scrolled through what appeared to be internal correspondence from Quantum Dynamics, complete with official letterheads and executive signatures. The documents suggested that Brandon's groundbreaking papers on controlled decoherence had actually been stolen from a classified government project, repackaged under his name to build his academic reputation. The investigation had been quietly settled out of court, with Brandon agreeing to disappear from the quantum computing field in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. Her phone rang before she could fully process the implications. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but when Victoria answered, she recognized the smooth, confident voice of Dr. Marcus Steele, TechNova's former head of quantum research, who had left the company 6 months ago under acrimonious circumstances. "Victoria, I assume you've received some interesting reading material about your new miracle worker," Marcus said, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone delivering a carefully timed blow. "I thought you should know what kind of man you're about to promote to hero status." Victoria's jaw tightened as the pieces fell into place. Marcus had been furious when she'd restructured the quantum division, reducing his authority and eventually pushing him toward resignation. His departure had been professional on the surface, but she'd heard through industry channels that he'd been spreading subtle criticisms of TechNova's direction to potential clients and partners. "Where did you get these documents, Marcus?" Victoria asked, her CEO instincts kicking in despite the shock of the revelations. "Let's just say that the quantum computing community is smaller than you think," Marcus replied smoothly. "Word travels fast when someone with Brandon Brock's colorful history suddenly emerges from hiding. I thought you deserved to know before you make any public statements that might embarrass the company." Victoria's jaw tightened as the pieces fell into place. Marcus had been furious when she'd restructured the quantum division, reducing his authority and eventually pushing him toward resignation. His departure had been professional on the surface, but she'd heard through industry channels that he'd been spreading subtle criticisms of TechNova's direction to potential clients and partners. "Where did you get these documents, Marcus?" Victoria asked, her CEO instincts kicking in despite the shock of the revelations. "Let's just say that the quantum computing community is smaller than you think," Marcus replied smoothly. "Word travels fast when someone with Brandon Brock's colorful history suddenly emerges from hiding. I thought you deserved to know before you make any public statements that might embarrass the company." The implicit threat was clear. Marcus had enough documentation to destroy not just Brandon's reputation, but TechNova's credibility if they were seen as harboring someone with a history of research misconduct. The timing was particularly devastating, with the International Technology Summit just days away. Any scandal could overshadow their quantum breakthrough and transform triumph into corporate disaster. "What do you want, Marcus?" Victoria asked, bluntly, already knowing that this conversation was leading towards some kind of ultimatum. "I want what's best for TechNova," Marcus replied with false sincerity. "And what's best is keeping this information private while handling the Brandon Brock situation quietly. I'm prepared to help you manage this crisis for the right considerations." Victoria understood the subtext immediately. Marcus wanted his old position back, probably with enhanced authority and compensation, in exchange for burying the evidence that could destroy both Brandon and TechNova's quantum program. It was corporate blackmail wrapped in the language of professional concern. After ending the call, Victoria spent the next hour researching the documents more carefully, using her industry connections to verify details and timelines. The evidence appeared authentic. Corporate seals, executive signatures, even media coverage from 3 years ago that had been carefully scrubbed from most online sources but still existed in archived industry publications. The devastating irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours after discovering that her company's salvation had come from an overlooked genius, she was learning that the same genius might be a fraud, whose entire career was built on stolen research and corporate betrayal. The quantum breakthrough that had saved TechNova could destroy them if it became public knowledge that their miracle worker was actually a discredited researcher with a history of intellectual property theft. Victoria's assistant knocked and entered with a stack of interview requests from technology journalists who'd gotten wind of TechNova's overnight quantum success. CNN, TechCrunch, Wired, The Wall Street Journal. Every major publication wanted to know how their company had achieved what IBM, Google, and Microsoft had been struggling with for years. "Schedule them for next week," Victoria said absently, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd learned. "And cancel my 4 p.m. meeting. I need time to think." Alone in her office, Victoria found herself facing the kind of decision that defines careers and companies. She could expose Brandon quietly, distance TechNova from any association with his work, and find a way to claim credit for the quantum breakthrough through her existing team. That path would protect the company, but destroy a man who might actually be innocent of the charges that had driven him into hiding. Alternatively, she could trust her instincts about Brandon's character and fight back against what was beginning to smell like an orchestrated campaign to discredit him. But that path risked everything: her company's reputation, her own career, and the financial security of 300 employees who depended on TechNova's success. The quantum computer's monitoring displays on her wall showed perfect operational parameters, running calculations that were advancing human knowledge in real time. Whatever Brandon's history, his work is undeniably brilliant and beneficial. The question was whether brilliance could survive the kind of character assassination that modern corporate warfare made possible. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. 24 hours to make the right decision. The industry is watching. The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. Marcus Steele and whoever was backing him had prepared a comprehensive campaign to destroy Brandon Brock, unless Victoria played by their rules.
As the Seattle skyline darkened outside her office windows, Victoria realized she was facing more than just a personnel decision. She was confronting the fundamental question of whether truth could survive in a world where perception was reality, and where the most devastating weapon wasn't inferior technology, but carefully crafted doubt about the people who created breakthroughs. Somewhere in the building below, Brandon Brock was finishing his maintenance rounds, unaware that his past had caught up with him and that his future hung in the balance of a CEO's choice between safety and justice. The emergency meeting in Victoria's conference room felt like a war council convening at midnight. Brandon sat at the far end of the polished table, his maintenance uniform a stark contrast to the business attire of TechNova's senior leadership team. Dr. Amanda Foster had printed copies of Marcus Steele's damaging documents, which now lay scattered across the table like evidence in a trial that could determine not just Brandon's fate, but the entire company's future. Victoria had spent the previous 6 hours conducting her own investigation, making calls to former colleagues, university contacts, and industry insiders. What she'd discovered painted a picture far more complex than Marcus Steele's carefully curated narrative of corporate betrayal and research misconduct. "Before we address the accusations," Victoria began, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of a CEO who'd made a decision that would define her leadership, "I want everyone to hear the real story. Brandon, tell them about Dr. Sarah Chen." Brandon's hands tightened in his lap, the mention of his former mentor's name bringing visible pain to his features. "Dr. Chen was my thesis advisor at MIT. She died in a car accident 6 months before my defense, taking with her the only evidence that could verify the origins of my research." Amanda leaned forward, her expression shifting from suspicion to interest. "What kind of evidence?" "Collaborative notes, preliminary calculations, recorded discussions about the theoretical frameworks that became my dissertation." Brandon replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Sarah always insisted that breakthrough research was never a solo effort. She documented everything, maintained detailed records of how ideas evolved through collaboration." Victoria pulled out her laptop and projected a series of documents onto the conference room's wall display.
I spoke with Professor Elena Rodriguez at MIT this afternoon. She was Dr. Chen's research partner and has been trying to reconstruct Sarah's lost research for 3 years. She confirmed that Brandon's work on controlled decoherence was developed in collaboration with Dr. Chen, not stolen from government projects. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Amanda studied the projected emails and academic correspondence with growing amazement. So the allegations against him were fabricated by someone who knew that Dr. Chen's death had left Brandon vulnerable to exactly this kind of character assassination, Victoria finished. The question is, who had both the motive and the resources to construct such an elaborate deception? Brandon spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of carrying this burden alone. Marcus Steele approached me 2 weeks before the quantum dynamics investigation began. He offered to help me handle the complicated patent issues surrounding my research. When I refused his assistance, he suggested I might face difficulties proving my work was original. The pieces clicked together with almost audible precision. Amanda's expression hardened as she understood the scope of the manipulation. Marcus orchestrated the entire scandal. He knew Dr. Chen had died, knew you couldn't verify the collaborative nature of your research, and used that vulnerability to force you out of the field. Victoria nodded grimly. And now he's trying to do it again, using the same fabricated evidence to discredit Brandon just as TechNova benefits from his expertise. She pulled out another document on her laptop, the real-time monitoring data from TechNova's quantum computer. But here's what Marcus didn't anticipate. The quantum stabilization that Brandon achieved last night isn't just functional, it's revolutionary. Our system is now running calculations that should theoretically require quantum computers that won't exist for another decade. Amanda checked her tablet, cross-referencing the quantum performance data with Brandon's published papers. The decoherence patterns match exactly what Brandon predicted in his 2020 theoretical framework. You can't fake this level of practical implementation of cutting-edge theory. Brandon looked up for the first time since the meeting began, hope flickering in his expression like a candle that had nearly been extinguished. Sarah used to say that truth has a signature that forgery can never replicate. The math doesn't lie, even when people do. Victoria stood and moved to the window overlooking the quantum lab, where the miraculous machine continued its groundbreaking calculations. Marcus gave me 24 hours to make the right decision. I've made it. We're not just keeping Brandon, we're promoting him to Chief Technology Officer and making his quantum breakthrough the centerpiece of our presentation at the International Technology Summit. The boldness of the decision silenced the room. Amanda was the first to speak, her voice carrying both admiration and concern. Victoria, if Marcus releases those fabricated documents, the media will crucify us. The tech industry loves a scandal, especially one involving stolen research and corporate cover-ups. Then we get ahead of the story, Victoria replied, turning back to face the room with the determination that had built TechNova from a struggling startup into a quantum computing powerhouse. Brandon shook his head, years of defensive instinct still intact. Victoria, you don't understand what you're risking. Marcus has connections throughout the industry. He can make this story toxic enough to destroy TechNova's reputation regardless of the truth.
And you don't understand what you've already given us, Victoria countered, her voice softening with genuine respect. Brandon, your quantum stabilization technique isn't just a repair, it's a breakthrough that puts TechNova years ahead of our competitors. That's worth fighting for. Amanda looked between Victoria and Brandon, recognizing the moment when corporate strategy aligned with moral imperative. What do you need from us? Victoria smiled, feeling the familiar rush of a calculated risk that could either elevate her company to new heights or destroy everything they'd built. I need you to prepare the most comprehensive technical presentation in TechNova's history. We're going to show the world not just what Brandon accomplished, but how he accomplished it. We're going to make Marcus Steele's fabricated scandal look like exactly what it is, the desperate attack of someone who couldn't compete with genuine innovation.
The conference room transformed from a crisis meeting into a planning session as TechNova's leadership team rallied around their hidden genius. Outside the windows, Seattle's skyline glittered with the lights of a technology industry that was about to witness either a spectacular vindication or a corporate catastrophe of epic proportions. But for the first time in 3 years, Brandon Brock was no longer hiding. The TechNova auditorium buzzed with the electric tension of an industry showdown as 300 of the world's most influential technology leaders filed into their seats for what many considered the most anticipated presentation of the International Technology Summit. Victoria Vale stood at the side entrance, watching her company's future unfold in real time as journalists, investors, and competitors took their places in the modern amphitheater that TechNova had specifically designed for moments like this. Brandon Brock waited in the wings, no longer wearing the maintenance uniform that had defined his identity for 8 months. The crisp white lab coat and TechNova CTO badge felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like putting on clothes that belonged to a person he'd almost forgotten he could be. In his hands, he held the leather notebook that had chronicled his observations and calculations, the same journal that would now serve as evidence in the most public vindication of his career. The morning had brought an avalanche of media attention that exceeded even Victoria's strategic expectations. Marcus Steele had indeed released his fabricated documents to every major technology publication, painting Brandon as a discredited researcher and TechNova as a company desperate enough to harbor intellectual property thieves. But Victoria's counteroffensive had been swift and devastating, a complete dossier of evidence that not only exonerated Brandon, but exposed Marcus's manipulation with forensic precision. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had flown in from MIT specifically for this presentation, bringing with her the recently discovered backup files from Dr. Sarah Chen's research. Digital evidence that proved beyond doubt the collaborative nature of Brandon's groundbreaking work. The revelation that Marcus had known about these files and actively suppressed them had transformed the story from corporate scandal to industry whistleblowing. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's voice carried across the auditorium's state-of-the-art sound system. Today's presentation will demonstrate not just a technological breakthrough, but a fundamental shift in how we think about quantum computing, human potential, and the extraordinary capabilities that sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. The main screen flickered to life with real-time data from TechNova's quantum computer, showing performance metrics that had been impossible just 72 hours earlier. Murmurs rippled through the audience as industry experts recognized readings that challenged their understanding of current quantum computing limitations. Marcus Steele sat in the third row, his confident expression already showing cracks as he realized that Victoria's presentation wasn't going to be the defensive damage control he'd anticipated. Beside him, representatives from competing quantum computing firms leaned forward with the intensity of people witnessing either a historic breakthrough or an elaborate corporate bluff. 3 days ago, Victoria continued, her voice building to the dramatic reveal she'd orchestrated, our quantum computer was experiencing systematic failure that had defeated the world's leading experts. IBM's team couldn't solve it. Stanford's researchers couldn't solve it. The European Quantum Consortium couldn't solve it. She paused, letting the weight of those failures settle over the audience. But someone did solve it, working alone, using theoretical frameworks that the academic world had dismissed as too radical to implement. Brandon stepped onto the stage, and the auditorium erupted in surprised murmurs as industry insiders recognized the face from both recent scandal headlines and older academic publications. The visual contrast was stark, the man who'd been portrayed as a disgraced researcher now standing confidently beside quantum performance data that spoke louder than any character assassination. Dr. Brandon Brock, Victoria announced, TechNova's Chief Technology Officer and the architect of what you're seeing on these displays. But before we discuss his quantum breakthrough, I want to address the allegations that have been circulating in certain media outlets. The main screen shifted to display a timeline that methodically dismantled Marcus Steele's fabricated narrative. Brandon watched from center stage as 3 years of careful lies collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. Dr. Chen's recovered research notes, university records, even recorded conversations that proved Marcus's early attempts to manipulate Brandon's patent applications. Dr. Rodriguez took the stage next, her MIT credentials lending additional weight to her testimony about the collaborative research that had produced Brandon's revolutionary quantum theories. "What you're witnessing today," she told the stunned audience, "is not just the vindication of a brilliant researcher, but the practical implementation of quantum computing concepts that were years ahead of their time."
The demonstration that followed left the technology industry speechless. Brandon guided the quantum computer through calculations that should have been impossible, explaining in real time how his controlled decoherence technique allowed the system to achieve stability levels that conventional quantum theories said were unattainable. The machine responded to his inputs like a musical instrument in the hands of a master composer, producing results that had competing firms frantically taking notes. "The quantum computer isn't fighting decoherence," Brandon explained to the rapt audience, his voice carrying the passion that had driven him through years of academic exile. "It's using decoherence as a navigation system, achieving quantum states that conventional approaches can't access because they're trying to eliminate the very patterns that guide optimal performance." Marcus Steele's face had gone ashen as he realized the complete collapse of his scheme. Several journalists were already approaching him with questions about the evidence that had exposed his fabrication of research misconduct charges. The man who'd hoped to destroy Brandon's reputation was instead watching his own credibility disintegrate in real time. The presentation climaxed with Brandon performing live quantum calculations that solved computational problems in minutes that would have taken traditional computers years to complete. The audience, hardened technology veterans who'd seen countless product demonstrations, sat in stunned silence as they witnessed the emergence of quantum computing capabilities that redefined their industry's future. "The lesson here," Victoria concluded as the auditorium erupted in sustained applause, "is that genius doesn't always announce itself with credentials and corner offices. Sometimes the most revolutionary solutions come from the people we overlook, the minds we underestimate, and the individuals who continue pushing boundaries even when the world has stopped watching." Brandon looked out at the standing ovation, seeing not just professional recognition but personal vindication for 3 years of hidden struggle. In the audience, he spotted Dr. Chen's former colleagues, quantum researchers who'd mourned both the loss of a brilliant mentor and the apparent scandal of her most promising student. Their tears of joy told him that Sarah's legacy had finally been properly honored. The technology summit that was supposed to end Brandon's career had instead marked the beginning of his triumphant return to the scientific community where he belonged. 6 months after the International Technology Summit, Brandon Brock's corner office on the 35th floor of TechNova's headquarters bore little resemblance to the maintenance closet where he'd once stored cleaning supplies. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's Elliott Bay, while multiple monitors displayed real-time data from quantum computers around the globe, not just TechNova's revolutionary system, but installations in laboratories from Tokyo to Geneva that were implementing his controlled decoherence protocols. The transformation extended far beyond office space. Brandon's nameplate now read, "Dr. Brandon Brock, Chief Technology Officer and Director of Quantum Innovation." But more importantly, the fear that had haunted his eyes for 3 years had been replaced by the confident focus of a scientist fully engaged with work that mattered. His published research papers, once buried under fabricated scandal, were now being cited as foundational texts for what the industry had dubbed the quantum renaissance. Emma bounded into the office with the boundless energy of a 9-year-old who just discovered that her janitor daddy was actually famous enough to have his picture in Scientific American. The custody arrangement that had once been Brandon's greatest source of anxiety had evolved into something far more generous, as his ex-wife recognized both his financial stability and the pride their daughter took in finally understanding why Daddy knew so much about science. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson wants to know if you can come to our science fair again this year," Emma announced, settling into the small chair Brandon had installed specifically for her after-school visits. "She said last year's presentation about quantum computers was the best parent talk in Jefferson Elementary's history." Brandon smiled, remembering the previous year's science fair, where he'd explained quantum entanglement using Emma's beloved invisible friendship bracelet analogy. The same theoretical concepts that at once required PhD-level mathematics to communicate could be understood by fourth graders when presented through the lens of curiosity rather than academic intimidation. "Of course I'll come," Brandon replied, saving his work on the latest quantum algorithm optimization. "What's your project this year?" "I want to explain how quantum computers can help doctors cure diseases," Emma said, with the serious expression she adopted when discussing science. "Tommy's mom has cancer, and I want to show how your computers might help find better medicines." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a CEO whose strategic gamble had paid off beyond her wildest projections. TechNova's stock price had tripled since Brandon's vindication, with their quantum computing division attracting contracts from pharmaceutical companies, aerospace manufacturers, and research institutions worldwide. The MIT delegation wants to discuss the quantum medicine initiative. They're proposing a collaboration that would give you a joint appointment as visiting professor while maintaining your role here. Brandon's eyebrows rose at the unexpected opportunity. MIT had been the scene of both his greatest academic triumphs and his most devastating personal losses, representing a complex mixture of professional validation and emotional baggage that he'd spent years avoiding. They specifically mentioned wanting to establish the Dr. Sarah Chen Memorial Research Laboratory, with you as the founding director. They believe your current work on quantum biological modeling represents the natural evolution of what you and Dr. Chen started together. Emma looked up from her tablet with the perceptive intelligence that consistently amazed her father. "That's your teacher who died, right? The one you told me about who said smart people should help other smart people?"
Brandon nodded, touched by his daughter's memory of the conversations they'd shared about mentorship, collaboration, and the way scientific knowledge built upon itself across generations. Dr. Chen's belief that breakthrough research was never a solo effort had proven prophetic in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The irony of MIT's invitation wasn't lost on Brandon. 3 years ago, the academic world had shunned him based on fabricated evidence and industry manipulation. Now, the same institution that had failed to defend him during his darkest period was offering him one of the most prestigious research positions in quantum computing. "There's something else," Victoria added, producing a tablet that displayed the latest industry newsletter. Marcus Steele's consulting firm filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Turns out that fabricating research misconduct allegations isn't a sustainable business model when your victims fight back with actual evidence. Brandon felt no satisfaction at his former tormentor's downfall, only the weary relief of someone who'd finally outlasted a storm that had threatened to destroy everything he valued. Marcus's manipulations had cost Brandon 3 years of hiding, but they'd also inadvertently led him to TechNova, to Victoria's partnership, and to the practical implementation of quantum theories that might never have emerged in traditional academic settings. Dr. Amanda Foster knocked and entered, carrying a stack of research proposals that had arrived from universities and corporations seeking collaboration with TechNova's quantum division. The woman who'd once struggled to understand quantum decoherence patterns now served as Brandon's deputy director, leading teams that were revolutionizing everything from artificial intelligence to material science. "The pharmaceutical trials are showing incredible promise," Amanda reported, her voice carrying the excitement of someone witnessing scientific history. The quantum molecular modeling system identified 3 potential cancer treatments last week that would have taken traditional computers decades to discover. Emma's eyes lit up with the particular joy of a child whose parents' work had obvious real-world benefits. "So your computers really can help sick people get better?" "We're just getting started," Brandon replied, thinking of the quantum biological modeling systems that were already showing potential for drug discovery, genetic therapy optimization, and medical diagnostic enhancement. The same controlled decoherence techniques that had saved TechNova's quantum computer were now being applied to problems that could save human lives. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from the reception desk. "Your 3 p.m. appointment is here," she announced, standing to leave. "Dr. Rodriguez from MIT, here to discuss the Memorial Laboratory proposal." As Victoria and Amanda departed, Brandon found himself alone with Emma and the weight of decisions that would define not just his career, but his legacy as a scientist and father. The girl who'd drawn pictures of her world's best scientist dad during his darkest period now lived in a reality where that childhood faith had been vindicated by the most public forum possible. Outside his office windows, Seattle's skyline reflected the afternoon sun, and somewhere in the building's quantum labs, machines were solving problems that would have been impossible just months earlier. The janitor who'd once emptied trash cans filled with discarded ideas was now generating innovations that were transforming multiple industries. The future that Dr. Sarah Chen had envisioned, where collaboration and curiosity drove breakthrough research, was finally becoming reality, one quantum calculation at a time. 2 years later, Brandon Brock stood before the gleaming nameplate outside the Dr. Sarah Chen Memorial Quantum Research Laboratory at MIT, watching his daughter Emma explain quantum entanglement to a group of visiting high school students with the same passion and clarity that had once characterized her grandmother figure's legendary teaching style. At 11, Emma had inherited not just her father's scientific curiosity, but his gift for making complex concepts accessible to minds hungry for understanding. The laboratory itself represented everything Dr. Chen had dreamed of, a collaborative space where theoretical breakthroughs merged seamlessly with practical applications, where the barriers between academic research and real-world problem-solving had been deliberately dissolved. Through the lab's transparent walls, Brandon could see researchers from TechNova working alongside MIT graduate students, their quantum computers humming with calculations that were revolutionizing medicine, climate science, and artificial intelligence. Dr. Elena Rodriguez emerged from the main laboratory, carrying a tablet that displayed the morning's research results. The woman who had once fought to preserve Dr. Chen's legacy now served as the Memorial Laboratory's academic director, overseeing research that honored their lost colleague's vision while pushing the boundaries of what quantum computing could achieve. "Brandon, you need to see this," Elena said, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of a scientific witnessing something unprecedented. The quantum biological modeling system just identified a potential treatment pathway for ALS that our neurological consultants say could represent the first real cure for the disease. The breakthrough represented more than just medical progress. It embodied the collaborative spirit that Dr. Chen had always championed, where brilliant minds worked together to solve problems that no individual researcher could tackle alone. The same isolation and competition that had nearly destroyed Brandon's career had been replaced by a research environment where success was measured not by individual achievement but by collective impact. Emma finished her explanation to the high school students and bounded over to her father with the infectious energy that had characterized her throughout his journey from hidden janitor to recognized innovator. "Dad, one of the students asked if quantum computers will ever be able to think like people do. I told her they already think better than people, they just think differently." The wisdom in her observation struck Brandon with the same force as his daughter's earlier insights about machines that could tell doctors where they hurt. Emma had grown up watching quantum computers evolve from mysterious failures to revolutionary tools, giving her an intuitive understanding of artificial intelligence that most adults struggle to achieve. She's right, Victoria said, smiling at the girl who had become like a daughter to her over the past year. Our quantum systems don't replicate human thinking, they complement it, solving problems that human minds can't approach while leaving the creative and ethical decisions to us. The afternoon schedule included a video conference with quantum research laboratories in 12 countries, all implementing variations of Brandon's controlled decoherence protocols. What had started as a desperate solution to save one company's investment had become the foundation for a global quantum computing renaissance that was transforming multiple industries simultaneously. Dr. Marcus Steele's name occasionally appeared in industry publications now, usually in cautionary articles about research misconduct and corporate manipulation. His attempt to destroy Brandon's career had ultimately exposed systematic corruption in academic peer review processes, leading to reforms that protected researchers from the kind of character assassination that had once driven brilliant minds into hiding. The Nobel Committee called again, Elena mentioned casually, though her smile suggested she understood the significance of the recurring inquiries about Brandon's eligibility for recognition. They're particularly interested in the medical applications of quantum biological modeling. Brandon shook his head with the same humility that had characterized his approach to recognition throughout his vindication and restoration. The real recognition is seeing our work save lives. Everything else is just ceremony. Emma looked up at her father with the pride that had sustained him through his darkest periods. Tommy's mom finished her cancer treatment last week. The doctor said the quantum medicine worked better than anything they'd tried before. The moment crystallized everything that mattered to Brandon. The knowledge that his research was alleviating human suffering, the partnership with Victoria that had enriched both his professional and personal life, and the daughter whose unwavering faith had reminded him that his value as a person transcended any professional recognition or failure. Through the laboratory's windows, the Charles River reflected the autumn sunset, and in quantum computers around the world, calculations continued that would shape humanity's future in ways still being discovered. The man who had once emptied trash cans filled with discarded ideas was now generating innovations that would outlive him by generations. Dr. Sarah Chen's vision of collaborative research driving breakthrough discoveries had become reality through the most unlikely path imaginable, a path that began with a janitor's quiet competence and culminated in a global network of scientists working together to solve problems that had once seemed impossible. As Emma continued explaining quantum concepts to fascinated visitors, Brandon realized that the greatest legacy wasn't the patents, publications, or prizes, but the knowledge that brilliance could emerge from anywhere, and that second chances, when coupled with unwavering determination, could transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human scientific achievement. The future that had once seemed lost was now brighter than Dr. Chen had ever dared to imagine. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.